While I love modern JRPG classics like Fire Emblem Three Houses, Xenoblade Chronicles 3, and Persona 5 Royal, the Nintendo Switch has a lot of classic JRPGs that are incredible, that help shape what we have today. So in this video, I'm going to be breaking down 30 plus classic must-buy JRPGs on the platform. This is 6th generation Xbox, GameCube, PS2, and down that we're going to be going over, and I'm almost positive that you're going to find some classic JRPGs that you haven't played yet that you're probably going to want to check out in the future. But before we get into that, what's good everyone, OJ here. Welcome back to another video. Please make sure you hit that like button, subscribe if you're someone new, and click that notification bell to get all of my JRPG content, Nintendo Switch live streams, and more first as soon as they go up. Now let's go ahead and jump right into the first classic JRPG, and we're talking about a GameCube legend, and that is Baten Kaitos 1 and 2 HD Remaster. Now this admittedly wasn't the best port job over from Bandai Namco, but it's still a really cool JRPG. It's got deep RPG mechanics for the card-based battle system, and it's really cool because within that card-based battle system, there's a lot of customization that you can do to your deck to really take advantage and do some cool magic and other things and really just bust the game at some point, so that's always a lot of fun. You've got a really cool story as well. There's a lot of revelations between the two games. In the package, you get the base game, and then you also get the prequel that takes place a couple decades beforehand, so it's really cool to see how it plays out over the course of both games. Now, this title is also developed by Monolith Soft of Xenoblade Chronicles fame. There's definitely some deep mechanics and a structure that Monolith Soft is known for that you'll absolutely see here. And there are a number of quality of life updates, like speeding up the gameplay, for example. So, Baten Kaitos 1 and 2 HD, very unique games, incredible GameCube games, and it's awesome that they're there for people to play on the Nintendo Switch. Next up is Earthbound from the Super Nintendo, and you can play this on the NSO Online Super Nintendo games, and this is a really quirky, weird, turn-based RPG that honestly, when I first saw the game, I thought it was ridiculous looking. I'm like, what is going on? Why is it in first person when you see enemies? Usually when I played an RPG back in the 90s, you see yourself, you see the enemy. It's either like an isometric or just like right behind the character, or maybe you're facing the character and then like the character attacks, right? But this was weird because it was actually in first person, which was just different, awkward for me, but I got used to it and I didn't like it at first, but over the years, I've grown to like Earthbound just a bit. Now, it's still not my favorite. I'm not going to sit here and say that Earthbound is like my favorite JRPG or I love it so much as some people, and the cult classic that it's kind of built itself up to be with all the different types of lore and memes and everything.
Come on, Reggie, give us Mother 3! How about this instead?
But at the same time, it's still one of the best classic JRPGs to play. Colorful, fun graphics. I think they're actually one of the best just because they're so weird. And also an ending, story and ending that's really going to make you think quite a bit. And awkward things that happen during the gameplay. Like certain stuff, if you don't do that and then like you find out about how to do it later, and you're like, wow, that was different, or that's something interesting. So a lot of like just little things, deep mechanics that are kind of built into the gameplay. Easy to pick up and play, hard to master when it comes to everything that you want to do in this game without looking up some type of guide or something like that. So Earthbound, absolutely one of the best classic JRPGs to play on the Nintendo Switch. Next up is Breath of Fire from the Super Nintendo. Now, Breath of Fire is one of those games that when I first played it, I was actually kind of intimidated a little bit. There was the random battles, of course, which was standard, but man, it seemed like every single 2 seconds you would be getting bodied by some enemy out of nowhere. But the fact that you can turn into a dragon completely kept me going through this game when I played it back in the day in my youth, and even when I replayed it when it came out on the NSO Online. I think that there are a number of rough edges with this game, but I love the main characters, I love the story, I thought the graphics were vibrant and nice. The combat system was, once again, easy to pick up and play, but definitely has a lot of depth for players to kind of sink their teeth into. So Breath of Fire, absolutely one of the best classic RPGs on the Nintendo Switch. Next up, Romancing Saga 3 from the Super Nintendo, and honestly, I was a late bloomer on this game in particular because I didn't play it back then. I had no idea what Romancing Saga was back in the day. It wasn't until recently when they started re-releasing the games on the Nintendo Switch and other platforms that I decided to really give it a shot. But out of all of the Romancing Saga games that I've played that have been re-released, Romancing Saga 3 stood out to me on the Super Nintendo. I loved the deep RPG mechanics. This game actually goes a bit deeper than some of the other like Final Fantasy games of its time and back then. There's a lot of cool turn-based mechanics in this game that really aren't newcomer friendly, but at the same time, if you actually stick with it, you're really going to get a rewarding and deep experience, deep RPG experience. Really love the story and the characters. I think the setting and the tone is so retro. It's so 16-bit Japanese RPG-ish. It'll really make you smile every now and then, but it does things so differently from these standard big RPGs. It'll feel different enough. I love the graphics in the game. Obviously, 16-bit Super Nintendo era is one of my favorites. So when I see games that kind of play out this type of way, I can't help but smile. It's just super beautiful to look at. Romancing Saga 3 absolutely should be on your list of big classic JRPGs to play. Next up is Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne HD Remaster. This is a PS2 certified banger that came over to some mixed results on the Nintendo Switch. And when I say that, it's because there's some lag in some areas, there's some long loading times in some areas. It's not quite as polished as it could be, but that could be because the game was built off of spaghetti code on the PlayStation 2, so they probably had some problems porting it over because there's issues on the PlayStation 4 version as well. But if you can get past that, if you can get through those and see the game for what it is, this is hardcore, man. It is brutal. It is in your face. It is straight up PS2 RPG and all of the good and bad that comes with it. Gameplay focused. You've got to be careful. At any point, an enemy can just wipe you out. SMT is that type of game. It really has that built-in difficulty, but there's a lot of depth. You have the different demons that you can recruit, put on your team, and the story is what keeps the game kind of going. It seems dystopian and it seems incredibly crazy. And I have to say this, Demi-fiend is one of the coolest main characters of all time in JRPGs because he just stands there with his shirt off and a pair of pants and just punches people. Like, he's like, doesn't need a shirt and he doesn't care. He'll just punch you in the face, and I love that. The music is super good in this game. The story, once again, holds up really well, even in today's time. The gameplay is fun. I think that there's a lot of cool different magic options. Obviously, it's the SMT, the classic press turn system. You exploit the weakness, you get another turn. So I love it. I really love SMT 3 Nocturne HD Remaster. Not the perfect transition from the PlayStation 2, but still a welcomed game to the Nintendo Switch's awesome classic library. Next up, Grandia HD Collection. This is a unique collection because you've got a PS1 game and a Dreamcast game. Grandia 2 hasn't quite held up as well as I thought it would. There's some awesome mechanics in there. Don't get me wrong, there's some awesome mechanics in there, and I still feel that it's a must play. They have this cool hybrid of real-time, turn-based with the first game, unique action bar, kind of fills up for real-time fighting. Like, I like what they've done, skill points and distribution. There's some cool things in both of the games, but I think visually, Grandia from the PlayStation 1 holds up so well. I'm a huge fan of those old school PS1 type of games being brought back, kind of make them HD, make them a bit more nice because the art just holds up better than those early rough polygonal 3D models and them trying to sharpen those out. So to me, I always like those PS1 games and those old school PS1 RPGs that come over and they put them in HD. It just looks so clean. The story in both games are charming and heartwarming, but also can be very serious at the same time. And once again, the battle systems in both games are still relevant. Some rough edges around the corners, right? Obviously, we're dealing with PS1 and Dreamcast here, But if you take the time to really get into the games, you'll see that there's so much charm and so much fun to be had with Grandia HD Collection. Plus, if you get it physical, you can have a rare game to your list. This game has started to shoot up in value over the years, so that's also another positive as well. So Grandia HD Collection, pick it up. It's one of the best classics on the Nintendo Switch. Next up is Star Ocean: The First Departure R. This is a Super Nintendo game turned PSP game turned remastered Nintendo Switch game. And even if you played the original Super Nintendo game back in the day, which I don't think was ever localized officially here in the West, it still plays incredibly well. Now the PSP version, which is what this game is based off of, is also just as good, if not better. A lot of quality of life features, other things that they've added in, but the gameplay just rocks. It's fast, it's fluid, it's fun, it's got a lot of different areas to go, characters to get, magic to have, and just a lot of awesome gameplay overall. And I think the story and the pacing is very well done. And I've talked about this before, and we're going to get into another game as well, but Star Ocean still plays better than all of the modern Star Ocean games. So even though this is a classic old JRPG, you can actually probably have more fun with it than some of the newer RPGs that are on the system. So I highly recommend Star Ocean: The First Departure R as a classic certified banger on the Nintendo Switch. Next up is Final Fantasy XII: The Zodiac Age, a classic PlayStation 2 title that had so much controversy surrounding it, but when it finally came out and people started to play, they kind of realized, hey, this is a really crazy system. But it was also the shift of Square Enix trying to make their RPGs not so classic turn-based and a bit more action kind of mixed into it. And they've added a bunch of quality of life features over the original PS2 version in this one, and I think that the scope and scale of Final Fantasy XII: The Zodiac Age, with all the different side quests and the characters and like this gambit system that can really allow you to just set everything up and everything just kind of fights by itself, it gets really in depth. And I think that it's controversial. Some people love it, some people hate it, but I think that if you're a fan of a game like Xenoblade, or if you're a fan of some of these MMOs that are out there, I think that Final Fantasy XII: The Zodiac Age is still a great classic game to go back to and play because of what they've done with it and because of all the stuff that it does. I think that people appreciate the game more now at this point than they did back when it came out, when you're in comparison to Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy VI and 7 and 9, some of the greatest ones, which we will talk about here. So I think that people appreciate the game a bit more now at this point than back then, and that's good because the game is awesome and it's a great game to pick up on the Nintendo Switch with a lot of content, a lot of fun to be had. Next up, Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga from the GBA. We've got a GBA sighting here, and Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga, like, it didn't start the Mario RPG revolution, but at the same time, I think that it was the perfect RPG for the handheld platform of the GBA. You have a lot of intuitive controls with Mario and Luigi. You've got a fun-loving story as well. Great GBA graphics. At least the style was awesome for its time, in addition to a bunch of different powers to collect Mario and Luigi, leveling up, classic RPG stuff, but also I would say nice enough to where it doesn't really take itself too seriously and you can just have fun. So Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga, I don't think it should be missed just because it really just brought about that new style of Mario RPG, which was a bit different than other RPGs out there and other classic RPGs on the GBA, for example. So make sure you check out Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga on the NSO app, originally from the GBA. Next up, Chrono Cross, the Radical Dreamers Edition, the original PlayStation 1 game brought back with a number of quality of life improvements and different things added in to just make it a great experience. And the most recent update actually improved the frame rate on the Switch version of the game, which is definitely a positive, and fixed a number of other little issues. So I have to recommend it as one of the best classic RPGs. But what I love about this game, despite it visually being a bit rough, once again, you have like those early 3D models with PS1, which look kind of awkward at times, but I think that what they tried with this game is to not just make a copy and paste of Chrono Trigger. Now, obviously, it's not as good as Chrono Trigger, and Chrono Trigger is not going to be on this list because it's not on the Nintendo Switch at this point, but I think that what they tried to do was create a very different style of game that was innovative and speaking to the audience on the PlayStation 1. It was something that they said, hey, we're not going to copy Breath of Fire, or we're not going to copy Final Fantasy, we're not going to copy any of these other games. We're going to create a whole different type of system that would be in line with the Chrono franchise going forward. And I think that there was some mixed results, but if you give it a shot, like many of the games on this list, it ends up being a great experience and a really cool throwback and ties to what Chrono Trigger was all about. There's so much cool stuff in this game. It kind of blew me away when I first played it, but I had a ton of fun going through and playing the game on the Nintendo Switch. The story still holds up really well. The music is incredible. Oh my gosh, the music is just so good in this game. So I'd absolutely recommend it as one of the best classic JRPGs on the platform. Next up, we've got more fire from the Super Nintendo. Yes, Breath of Fire 2 on the NSO app. And this game takes what I talked about with the original and then times it by like 2, 3, or 4 or something like that. Breath of Fire 2 is one of the most underrated JRPGs of all time. It does not get enough credit for what it did when it comes to replay value, when it comes to magic, when it comes to transformations, when it comes to a lot of these things that we've seen in other RPGs that came after that. Breath of Fire 2 was a game that innovated in many of these things and then took the ideas that we know from Final Fantasy or from other RPGs and made those just as good. The combat was refined, very fun and fluid and fast, even for the Super Nintendo standards, where sometimes things go a bit slow. Breath of Fire 2 was a game that said, okay, you're gonna have fun while you play this game. It's a turn-based RPG, but it's super fun. Plot's good, the writing's good. There's so many incredible things about Breath of Fire 2 that I loved, and I think that for me, the story and how things played out, and I'm trying not to do spoilers whenever I talk about these games because they're classic, but I want you guys to experience them. I think that Breath of Fire 2's story absolutely just kind of hit me right there in the feels. Like, the game is just so somber at times, but then it can also be uplifting. There's so many incredible things that the plot kind of takes you through. So Breath of Fire 2 is one of those games that just takes the original, just absolutely destroys it in pretty much every single category. And it's one of the unsung heroes of Japanese RPGs if you go back and look at what people truly say about this game. So if you haven't played Breath of Fire 2, definitely check it out on the NSO Nintendo Switch Online. Next up, Dragon Quest 1 plus 2 plus 3 collection. And yes, I know, we're all waiting for Dragon Quest 3 HD 2D remake. That game's going to be incredible, but until then, this collection is not bad. NES games, the original, Dragon Quest, Dragon Warrior, you guys know it. Dragon Quest is huge now at this point, but if you wanted to go back and see the roots of how these games played, it's all right here. Now, yes, rough around the edges, obviously old school NES games, but Dragon Quest 3, The Seeds of Salvation, is still really good. That's why they're remaking that one, because it's still a good game that holds up to today's day. They take all the systems and mechanics and different things that they improved upon each of the first two games and add that into pretty much like, okay, this is the game. This is the awesome game that's going to have a bunch of cool things. And everything that's in this collection is just great value, and it's still a lot of fun to play, especially if you like the old school retro games. Clearly, Dragon Quest, obviously turn-based combat, music that's for some people, not necessarily for me, but it's for some people that do like old school NES Dragon Quest music. So it's all there. And with this collection, you get 3 great games, but one incredible game with Dragon Quest 3. So Dragon Quest 1 plus 2 plus 3, pick them up. Dragon Quest games, always good classic fun on the Nintendo Switch. Let's get into Final Fantasy X/10-2 HD Remaster. This is from the PlayStation 2, and I remember distinctly hating 10-2, that game, back when it came out, just because I wanted it to not have that setting and everything. But when I replayed the game, after playing Final Fantasy X, I was like, okay, 10-2 has its flaws, but it's still a solid, good game. It's not like it's a bad RPG overall. There's some weird stuff that's in there. There's some really crazy PS2 level stuff that's in there, but the music, the quality of the graphics, the gameplay, everything within this collection, because you get both games in this one, everything within this collection is just awesome. Final Fantasy X was one of those games that really brought the JRPG experience to the next gen. When it came out on PS2, there was really nothing like it because it was one of the first PS2 games, but it really showed you what the PS2 can do and what Japanese developers, what Square Enix can do with a huge budget, obviously next generation graphics and everything, because we were in the 32-bit era and the 64-bit era, and we had never seen anything to the level of Final Fantasy X. And then 10-2 just kind of came out and said, all right, let's clean up this mess that we made at the end of 10. But they're both fantastic games. I like 10 a bit more. The sphere grid is really good, upgrading, getting different types of levels and abilities and equipment. It always feels like you're progressing in the game with all of your characters. So that's what I love about the mechanics and the systems in Final Fantasy X and how they did it. If you haven't played it, it's a classic that just must be played. Even if you end up not liking it, just to see kind of where a lot of Square Enix saw different things, or even other RPGs that copied from them. Final Fantasy X was one of those games, so I have to have it on my list as must buy Nintendo Switch Classic RPGs. Next up is a game that's a classic PS1 title, but remade and re-brought back to the new age. That is Star Ocean, the Second Story R, and this was originally from the PlayStation 1. The fact that they brought it back in this type of way, I've been playing through. And yes, most of these games are classic games, and this is a classic remade game, but I wanted to include anything that was really faithful to the original, but then also added in other things. And that's what this game does. It's a faithful recreation of the original game, but with a bunch of added things, updated visuals, and all of that. And it turns out really well. I love this game and I'm still going through it. And what I like the most about it is the combat system. The combat system is super fluid. Whether you're blasting people with magic in the game, or you're going through with Claude and fighting and kind of backstepping and dodging and learning different types of attacks and linking things, it's always fun. You always feel like you're leveling up, or you're getting new skill points, you're getting something else in the game. You've got a lot of different characters that you can use as well. And the environments, the combat, the gameplay, the enemies, there's a lot of variety too as well. And everything's pretty snappy and fast on the Nintendo Switch as you're playing it through. Some load times that are a little bit long compared to the PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5 version of the game, but overall I'm still having a blast playing it portably with the Nintendo Switch. And the game was always great. It was great on the PlayStation 1, but it's so much better bringing it to the modern systems here and at this point, and the Nintendo Switch, in order to get some of those kind of needed quality of life updates, in addition to letting people know that this exists. Star Ocean is not necessarily what you think it is with all of the most recent games that haven't reviewed the best. Still solid games for some people, but haven't necessarily reviewed the best. And then this game comes out and people are loving it. The critics are loving it. So for me, Star Ocean, the Second Story R had to be a classic must-buy game that I included in this, as it's new and there's a lot of cool new things, but it's still that core root classic PS1 game. Next up is Fire Emblem, the Blazing Blade, or simply just Fire Emblem as it's known here in the West. This is from the GBA, and it's on the Nintendo Switch Online app for Game Boy Advance. And what I love about this game, it's classic Fire Emblem. It's the classic Fire Emblem that you know and love if you've played Three Houses, if you've played some of these other ones, but it's back then. You don't have the casual and the hardcore modes and different type of things. It's like one difficulty for the most part, and it's, hey, your units die, they're done. There is no toggle or anything like that. It's hardcore, it's old school, and if you want that unit back, you better restart that chapter or just deal with them being gone for forever. Obviously, this is the prequel game to Roy's title. You play as Roy's dad, you play as Hector, you play as Lynn. You'll know these characters from Fire Emblem Engage if you're more of a newer fan. And it's great. It's great tactical gameplay, fantastic story, great GBA graphics for what the GBA can do, variety of heroes to recruit, classic hardcore gameplay, just all the stuff that makes Fire Emblem incredible kind of started here, at least in the West. And I loved my time going back and reminiscing about this game because I wasn't a big Fire Emblem fan back then. I didn't start playing really hardcore playing Fire Emblem till the 3DS era. And then I had to go back and play the old school ones. And when this one came out, I was like, okay, great. I can replay it again, and it's so good if you give it the chance and opportunity. So Fire Emblem, or Fire Emblem the Blazing Blade, absolutely one of the best must-play classic games on the Nintendo Switch. Next up, let's get into a triple pack of greatness, and that is Collection of Mana. These games are from the Game Boy and the Super Nintendo, and for me, really, it's Secret of Mana. That was the game that I played back in the day that I truly felt that RPGs, JRPGs in particular, are going to be a lifelong passion for me. It was an action RPG with this little meter that builds up, and then you can attack and you can get a stronger attack if you wait for it. You've got magic, you've got really expressive characters. It was just super fun. Great music. You've just got everything that you would love on a weekend when you're done with school, and to be able to just jump into this fantasy world. Mode 7 graphics when you blast it off in the cannon. I mean, there was so many cool things. It almost makes me a bit emotional talking about the classic times that I had with Secret of Mana, because I used to play it and beat it over and over again. It was just a super unique and fun concept, and one of the first games that I know of with the JRPG that you can play multiplayer with your friends. It was up to 3 players multiplayer, which just blew my mind because pretty much every JRPG that I played to that point were single player. So the fact that you can play with your friends just made it kind of go to the next level for me. Now, Trials of Mana, or Seiken Densetsu 3, is on the collection as well. There's a remake of that game on the Nintendo Switch, Trials of Mana, which I didn't include in this one just because of the number of things that has been changed over it. But I think that the Collection of Mana still holds up. Secret of Mana 3 on there still holds up very well, and it's a great collection just to have one, but also 2 to play as well. Not as big of a fan as the original Game Boy game, but that's okay. You still get awesome games with Secret of Mana and Seiken Densetsu 3 on there. So absolutely play it, but especially Secret of Mana from the Super Nintendo. Must play, must buy classic Nintendo Switch RPG. Next up is Final Fantasy VII, one of my favorite games of all time. Also a game that I put on my other list for 10 out of 10 RPGs. And to me, you really have to transport yourself back to 1996, 1997, when the hype and when the release for Final Fantasy VII was happening. Honestly, guys, there was nothing like it. I had never seen the cutscenes. I had never seen the style of gameplay. Bringing a massive JRPG world over to the 32-bit era was just such a foreign concept. It just didn't happen. We didn't see it. And when we finally saw it in that sense, with how cool Cloud looked and the art and the motorcycle and Barrett with his freaking machine gun arm and Tifa punching and kicking and Aerith and this huge guy with this long sword Sephiroth and the long white hair, it was just a work of art. It was a work of art that I'll remember forever when I first played it, and then when I first beat it later on down the line when I finally got my own PlayStation 1. It was just a memorable experience. The combat system's great. It's not like it's the greatest thing ever, the most innovative, but it's got the ATB, it's got the magic, it's got the materia, it's got depth. It's still very viable in today's day, in my opinion, and it's still one of the best classic PS1 games being brought over to Nintendo Switch. Must play, must buy. You gotta play it if you're into JRPGs. You just have to. It's FF7, one of the most monumental, influential RPGs of all time. Next up is Super Mario RPG, and no, I'm not talking about the classic game because the classic game isn't on the Nintendo Switch. I'm talking about the new game, the remake. That's a one-to-one remake with the original, but with some added stuff. So the story, the combat, the gameplay, a lot of the scenarios, the writing, everything's pretty much the same, but with upgrades and additions. There are tweaks across the board, but it's still a turn-based RPG. They didn't Final Fantasy VII remake it or anything like that, right? So that's why I'm including it on this list. It's not out yet as of the time that I'm recording this video, but I've played the original, I've seen a lot from the virtual preview that I had here, and honestly, I already know, because if I did a list for my top 25 Super Nintendo RPGs of all time, or best RPGs, this game would be on there. This game would be on there for one of my best games of all time. Like if I did like a top 50 or 100, it'd be on that list. So I already know with the upgrades, the additions from what they're doing here, and like the classic music that you have that's just so good. You can pick between different ones from the quality of life features that they've upgraded. This will easily be one of the best classic RPGs on the Nintendo Switch. Once again, kind of hard because it's not the Super Nintendo game, it's a remake of that, but I still am counting it, just like I'm counting Star Ocean the Second Story R as one of the best classic RPGs on the platform. Next up, some might say, is the best Final Fantasy of all time, but I think a couple games would have a word with that, and that is Final Fantasy IX from the PlayStation 1 on the system. And Final Fantasy IX is interesting because one of these games that I didn't play at first. I had to wait a little bit before I got my PS1 and I was able to play it. But when I finally did, I was like, wow, this was the Final Fantasy swan song for the PlayStation 1, and I can see why it's so great. I played it back in the day, but then when I really played it on my Nintendo Switch, I was like, goodness gracious, this is even better. I always had Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy VII as in like the upper echelon and everything. When it comes to Final Fantasy, nothing can top it. But honestly, Final Fantasy IX is right there with those games. Now, it might not be as monumental when it comes to groundbreaking as Final Fantasy VI or Final Fantasy VII, but to me, it's just as good, if not better, when it comes to the combat mechanics and even the story. The story is so good in this game, and it feels like they perfected the PS1 by that point. They're pretty much tapping out the PS1, doing everything they could with that Final Fantasy engine, with what they can do with audio and graphics and cutscenes. So to me, Final Fantasy IX, absolutely one of the must play, and it was even one of my 10 out of 10 RPGs that I had on my previous video with that. Now, I alluded to this before with this next classic game, Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster. You get a bunch of games, but the game that we're going to be focusing on, because you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but then there's Final Fantasy VI. And along with Final Fantasy IX, these are the upper echelon. Final Fantasy VII, these were just such classic, incredible games. But Final Fantasy VI has one of the craziest plots with one of the most deranged main villains that you will ever see in a game. It has to be played to be believed, not seen, but played to be believed with the writing. You have to be in the moment. And I think the Pixel Remaster does a great job of bringing that back to life, bringing it to a new audience and giving it just that visual touch and flair, being able to play on the go anywhere. Final Fantasy VI still holds up. So many characters to get, to recruit, a lot of depth with the combat in terms of what you can do there. Some crazy scenes and scenarios that I'll let you guys figure out if you haven't played it yet, but I love Final Fantasy VI. It was a crazy, super huge RPG that just felt too big even for the Super Nintendo, but as I replayed it, I felt, man, all the rush of the emotion and the different things that are in this game just kind of came back and hit me with it. And that's what a lot of these classic games will do. The nostalgia is there, kind of packed in. Next game up was interesting because I felt maybe should I put this one in or not, but really at its core, its base, it's a PlayStation 2 game. So we're going to talk about Persona 3 Portable, which is on the Nintendo Switch, which is weird because we have various renditions of Persona. So Persona 3, the original on PS2, Persona 3 FES on PS2, Persona 3 Portable on the PSP, and then Persona 3 Portable on the Nintendo Switch in HD. But once again, the base is a PS2 game, and then of course they've added things on over each iteration with what they've done, but I'm still going to consider it a classic or retro game, and it's absolutely phenomenal. Now, and it's not as good as a game that we're going to talk about here in the last one, but it's still an incredible experience with fantastic gameplay. That's the reason why they're remaking it into a big game that's coming out next year. But I want to talk about Persona 3 Portable because the game does a lot of really good things with the plot. I think the plot is fantastic, how it's structured, put together. Persona games, this was the first one to try out the different type of lifestyle simulation kind of put in there with the social links and everything. The first and second Persona games were more similar to what you'd see with SNT. This is where things really branched out and where Persona got far more popular, especially here in the West. And I love me some Persona 3 Portable. I think it's a great experience. I love the combat in the game, the all-out attacks, all the different stuff that you can do, building up with your teammates. It's a lot of fun, and just the Persona press turn system of exploiting weaknesses is as good as it's ever been, and even more addictive in this game. So for me, Persona 3 Portable is absolutely one of the best classic retro games to buy on the Nintendo Switch, and should be played by anybody who is a turn-based RPG fan, because it really is that good, with some annoying things and a last boss that will rip through you if you are not prepared. But we've got one more game to talk about, and that is Persona 4 Golden. This is originally Persona 4 from the PlayStation 2, and then it was on the Vita, and now it's on the Nintendo Switch. And I'm counting it as a classic game as well, because that base is from the PlayStation 2 era. And Persona 4 Golden kind of does everything right. There's not really any inherent flaws. Very much like a lot of my games that I have here at the end. It's so packed full of content. The story is so well done. The graphics and the gameplay really just all gel and mend together. The music is by far one of the best ever. So it's such good music. And I think that music is so important in a JRPG. And I didn't really talk about this too much, but I've emphasized great music. It's so important because you're going to hear that same battle system. You're going to hear that same boss theme. You're going to hear a lot of themes over and over. And if the music is grinding or grating or not really good, you're going to really be affected by that. And that's why Persona 4 Golden does not have that issue whatsoever, because the music is incredible in the game. So for me, it all just kind of melds together with the fusion system that they have, with the great all-out attacks and the classic Persona gameplay, the cool themes that they have, and how the gameplay flows with the social links and side quests and just the classic Persona formula all kind of put in together for one of the best JRPGs that I've ever played, and a must-buy, must-play on the Nintendo Switch. Those are 30 plus must-buy classic JRPGs on the Nintendo Switch you need to go out there and pick up. Are there any games that I was missing? More stuff that I should talk about? Let me know in the comment section below. All right, guys, that wraps it up for this video here. Thank you so much for watching. I do appreciate it. Please make sure you hit that like button, subscribe if you're someone new, click that notification bell, and check out my other JRPG videos on screen right here. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you for the next one. Peace.